Hi, my name is Katie, and this is Yapping About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. This week, we're going to be talking about the only successful coup in the United States of America, and you may be thinking to yourself, there's been a coup there? And the answer is yes. Yes, there has. And the next thing you're probably thinking is, damn, why haven't I heard about this? Well, I think you'll be able to figure out why that is once we get into the story. So let's get into it. For a little bit of background, we're going back to 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington was a very prosperous town in the late 1800s. It was a port town, and trains would bring exports from all over the US to Wilmington to ship across the world. But before we go further, let's just back it up actually a little bit further to orient ourselves better into this time period. The Civil War ended in 1865, and after that began a period called Reconstruction, in which the US was trying to figure out how to deal with Confederate states, the economic and physical destruction, and how to integrate Black people into the country. Because after the war had ended, 4 million enslaved Africans found themselves free. The 14th and 15th Amendments passed during this time made them US citizens who were able to vote, well, the men, and participate in US politics and begin to make lives for themselves. Reconstruction was viewed as a second revolution. And just a quick civics reminder for this episode, during this time, Republicans were the anti-slavery party and the Democrats were the party of slave owners and Confederates, but later on in time, we do kind of see an ideological shift in those two parties. But with an economic depression in 1893, we see a rise of a third party in Wilmington, referred to as either the Populists or the Fusionists. They were called Fusionists because it brought Black and white Republicans together with poor white farmers who were hurting economically. They started to undo a lot of the policies that the Democrats had put into place. And soon, Wilmington embodied the Reconstruction movement. It was a good place to find work for Black people. There was a lot of skilled and unskilled jobs available. And soon, Wilmington had a population that was 50% Black. Very quickly, a Black professional class began to emerge in Wilmington. There was Black doctors, lawyers, business owners, and they were members of the police and fire department. They were able to acquire wealth, own homes, and invest in Black-owned banks. And by 1896, nearly 126,000 Black men in Wilmington were registered voters. Black Republicans held multiple positions of power, serving as city councilmen, magistrates, and other elected officials. And Black and white people would sell their wares side by side in the downtown markets, which was still very rare for this time. One example of Black success was a man named Alex Manley, who was the editor of the Daily Record, the only Black-owned newspaper in the U.S. at this time. And in a testament to how popular the newspaper was and how Wilmington was beginning to integrate was that white-owned businesses would actually advertise in Manley's newspaper. Now we're going to fast forward back to 1898. The rapid rise to success and wealth upset a lot of white people, and this time period also sees the rise of the KKK, violence, harassment, and assassinations targeting Black people. And Reconstruction ends only 10 years after the end of the Civil War, when the Union troops leave the South, because they were the ones that were enforcing these Reconstruction laws. For example, the North Carolina State Democratic Executive Committee's Democratic Handbook from 1898 stated, quote, "But there is one thing the Democratic Party never has done and never will do, and that is to set the Negro up to rule over white men. It is no fault of the Negro that he is here, and he is not to be punished for being here, but this is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it," end quote. The Democratic Party at the state level began pushing white supremacy in 1898 as the tool to break up this fusion government that had been set up in Wilmington. And we're going to focus on three main dudes that led this movement: Fernfold Simmons, great name, Josephus Daniels, and Charles Aycock. Simmons is the state chairman of the Democratic Party. He's a strategic thinker, and he recently had lost an election to a Black man, so I'm sure there's some personal beef going on with him. Daniels was the publisher of the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina. He presented as a journalist, but truly he was a politician at heart. Newspapers were very powerful. Remember, this is the only real way that people got their news. And Daniels came from a working class background and was involved in the Democratic Party, but nothing really too crazy until he buys buys the newspaper. But after that, he raises money from white supremacists and makes his newspaper a propaganda tool for them. Daniels also calls himself the militant voice of white supremacy. He used the terms like Negro rule and Negro domination in a lot of his newspaper articles to convey this false narrative that Black people had taken over the government and were coming for white people. Even though it should be pointed out that the fusion government still had way more white Republicans than Black Republicans in the government, but to Daniels and other white men like him, it was a problem that any Black people had power at all. Then we have a group of white men called the Secret Nine, which was basically the Chamber of Commerce or the white business elite. They wanted to ensure that they kept their wealth and status at the top of the pyramid. And they meet to discuss how to get rid of the successful Black people in Wilmington and how to solve the quote Negro problem once and for all, because they felt like their fathers had failed in this regards because they had lost the Civil War. Daniels knew that over 25% of the white electorate was illiterate, and so he hired a cartoonist to draw cartoons that showed what would happen or what was happening with this Negro rule. He would then combine these cartoons with almost constant coverage of Black crime and corruption, especially the classic trope of Black men raping and lusting over white women. And I would encourage you to look up these political cartoons from his newspaper and this time in general. It's very clear what they're doing in the cartoons. It shows them using white supremacy to break up the fusion voting bloc. Like, the cartoons literally say white supremacy. So you can't be like, oh, well, we don't really know what they were thinking, or, oh, well, that's just the time, or, oh, they weren't really racist. We don't know what's in their hearts. No, everyone knew what they were doing. And so I don't see why it's a big problem to just say what they were doing. You know, this rhetoric was being dispersed all throughout the South during this time. It was not just North Carolina. So it's not surprising that in the 1890s, we see a huge uptick in lynchings. And again, a lot of these were sparked by claims by white women of rape by Black men. And this was the main way that the Democrats went about trying to break up the fusion vote. They basically tried to guilt and shame the white working class men who were voting fusion to turn on their Black counterparts. And then the third guy that I mentioned, Charles Aycock, he was a young lawyer and a stump speaker in North Carolina, and he often incited white men to violence. In one of his speeches, he said, quote, "No man who loves his state can read the daily occurrences of crimes in North Carolina where the Negro is the aggressor without trembling for the future of the state. There have been more assaults upon white women by Negro brutes in 1 year and a half of Republican rule than in 20 years of Democratic rule." End quote. And combined, these powerful men basically ran a campaign targeting white fusionist men and said that them voting with Black men, they were putting their wives and daughters in harm's way. Now we find ourselves in August of 1898, 3 months before the coup. Rebecca Felton, who really gets the violence going in a speech that she gives to Georgia Agricultural Society. She was a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Hint, hint, we'll be talking about them later. She says, quote, "Where there is not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin, nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltering arm around innocence and virtue, if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possessions from ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary." End quote. So the Wilmington homies hear this speech and they're like, great, we can use this. So they reprint her speech in their newspapers. So Alex Manley, remember the Black editor of the Black newspaper, sees Rebecca Felton's words and he writes an editorial in response to her speech. He is basically like, why is it okay for white men to be attracted to and intimate with colored women, but when it's a Black guy and a white woman, the Black guy gets lynched? He counters the stereotype that Black men are big burly brutes by saying most of them had white fathers, because a lot of white slave owners would rape their enslaved women. He said that they're not actually brutes or burly, but they are seen as attractive by white women. He also says that, quote, "Poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women," end quote, and that, quote, "Our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than the white men with colored women," end quote. And as you can imagine, this sexually charged editorial was reprinted across the state, and it provided the Democrats an actual piece of what they thought was evidence to really inflame racial tensions as Election Day approached. Because one of the worst things you could do, especially as a Black man, was to speak ill of white women. And in that regard, Manly kind of plays right into their stereotype in the white men's eyes. And the thing is, even if the other prominent Black men agreed with Manly in private, a lot of them in Wilmington urged Manly to recant his editorial to avoid further conflict. But Manly is like, nope, I didn't do anything wrong. So the building owner where Manly ran the Daily Record told him he needed to move out because that guy was afraid of what the white men might do in retaliation to him or his building. So Manly moves into what would be called a community center today, which was for Black people. And then during the summer and the fall leading up to the election, the white supremacists and Democratic groups start to perpetuate the myth that Black people were gearing up for some sort of race riot in Wilmington. They printed things like, quote, Negroes are trying to buy guns, end quote, and that they're getting ready for trouble, etc. But in reality, it was the white men who were preparing for violent confrontation. Also during this time, the White Government Union was created, and their constitution states that their purpose was to, quote, reestablish in North Carolina the supremacy of the white race, end quote. And then another white supremacy group called the Red Shirts from South Carolina start coming up to North Carolina, and they were encouraged to do so by the South Carolina Senator Ben Tillman, who said that, quote, bullets are better than ballots, end quote, when dealing with Black people. The Red Shirts would ride around at night, attack Black people's homes, rip them out of their houses, whip them, and then threaten them that if they went out and voted, that they would kill them. These white supremacist groups would hold rallies and parades in Wilmington, and then they'd follow them up with barbecues where speakers would tell the white men in the crowds that they need to fight for their women and that their safety and honor were what was at stake with the fusionist government and letting Black people be in charge. And so now we get to 1 month before the election. The white supremacy groups don't think that white people are riled up enough. So that's where another man comes in. His name is Alfred Waddell. He is a Civil War vet, kind of washed out. Even other white supremacy groups don't really like him and thought he was obnoxious, but he did give rousing, violent speeches, so they let him kind of just do his thing in Wilmington. North Carolina had 2 militias that were supposed to report to the governor, who was a Republican at the time, but the leaders of the militia were also leaders of white supremacy groups. So even though they were sent to fight in the Spanish-American War that was going on at this time, those leaders made sure that their groups were sent home before the midterm elections so that they could participate in keeping Black people from voting. There was also a Black regiment of the militia, but they were kept on duty for the Spanish-American War because they knew that they were essentially the only group that could potentially help the Black people that were living there. These white militia and the Secret Nine start to prepare for war. They get a few different early prototypes of what ends up being the machine gun, and they start stockpiling guns and ammunition. Right before the elections, a group actually takes the Black government leaders out onto a tugboat and demonstrate how these new machine guns work, which is just a blatant intimidation tactic. Another thing they start to do before the election was to patrol the Black voting areas with guns to intimidate Black men and try to keep them from even coming out to vote in the first place. Understandably, the Black men start to think that maybe they shouldn't vote to avoid the violence and also prevent themselves from being fired from work and the other consequences that could come about. But the Black women find out about this and they would not hear of it. The Organization of Colored Ladies wrote in the newspaper, quote, any man who doesn't register to vote shall be branded a white-livered coward who would sell his liberty and the liberty of our whole race to the demons who are even now seeking to take away the most sacred rights vouchsafed to any people, end quote. They were not messing around. Alex Manly posts an article saying that the white men actually aren't that crazy to really inflict violence on their neighbors. He doesn't take the bait and he urges everyone to stay calm and encourages everyone to vote because that's essentially what the propaganda is trying to stop them from doing. But unfortunately, he ends up being very wrong. A Black delegation made up of local ministers went to the US President McKinley in Washington, D.C. to warn him about what was going on in North Carolina Carolina and Wilmington specifically. And although McKinley was a Unionist and abolitionist, he was also running for a re-election in 1900, and he felt like he needed the white vote, so he refused to do anything and to send federal troops. The Attorney General also reminds the delegation that it's actually up to the North Carolina governor to ask for troops to be sent in. And that man was Governor Russell. He had grown up in Wilmington and knew a lot of the white supremacist people. Some were even his relatives. So he was easily manipulated by them, and they had told him that there would be no trouble as long as he didn't put any Republicans up for election in the county. Russell agrees to this because he was very intimidated by them, and so all the fusion candidates that were running end up withdrawing. 3 days before the election, Waddell gives another speech at a white supremacy rally saying, quote, "Men, the crisis is upon us. You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You are the sons of noble ancestry. You are Anglo-Saxons. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find a Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks." End quote. Now it's election day. Armed white men are out in force patrolling to make sure that no black men vote. They also had coordinated plans to stuff the ballot boxes with Democratic votes and to remove any Republican ones by charging into a polling place, crashing into things, kind of making a distraction, even starting a small fire. And so while everyone's focused on that, they would swap out the ballots. And not surprisingly, white supremacists win in a landslide statewide in North Carolina. Even with their success at the polls, the white supremacists in Wilmington are not satisfied because you see, it was not a municipal election, so there were still Black fusion elected officials in office in Wilmington. And they wanted to get rid of them and any white people who had allied with the Black representatives. So they call a meeting at the steps of the courthouse for all the white men in Wilmington in order to conduct further business of white supremacy. Hundreds show up and they compose a, quote, White Wilmington Declaration of Independence. It says in part, quote, "Believing that the Constitution of the U.S. contemplates a government to be carried on by an enlightened people, believing that its framers did not anticipate enfranchisement of an ignorant population of African origin, and believing that those men of the state of North Carolina who joined in forming the Union did not contemplate for their descendants subjection to an inferior race, we, the undersigned citizens of the city of Wilmington and county of New Hanover, do hereby declare we will no longer be ruled and never again will we be ruled by men of African origin." End quote. They also created a committee of 25 to carry out their demands. Waddell was made chair because he had made himself basically the face of the movement. And this committee makes a list of about 30 leading Black people in town and summon them so that this group of Black men would essentially convince the rest of the Black population to submit to their demands. So then a German grocer and friend of Alex Manly's hears about what's going on, convinces Manly to leave town because it was very likely at this point that the white supremacist groups were going to end up lynching him. This friend of Manly's gives him $25 and a password to hopefully get him safely out of town. So Manly and his brother, who were white passing, they decide to listen to the friend and they start to head out. They come across a patrol and they give them the password, and the patrolmen say, like, "Where are you going? We're having a necktie party tonight," aka lynching. And the Manlys say that they're on their way to a horse auction, and the patrolmen say, "All right, we'll let you go. But if you see Alex Manly, kill him for us, would you?" And then they actually give the Manlys a rifle. The committee had given the Black leaders roughly a 12-hour deadline to respond. So they deliver their response to Waddell's mailbox that night, but Waddell pretends that he never got the memo because it wasn't directly handed to him. Now it's 2 days after the election, and Waddell has his red shirts get into formation, and they march down to Manly's printing press looking to lynch him. And what starts as 500 armed white men soon swells to 2,000 as other white men see this group marching through town and they join. They can't find Manly, so they destroy the printing press building and set it on fire. You might have actually seen the picture of them standing in front of the burned out building smiling. It's a very famous photo. of that time, and that picture is actually turned into postcards, and people would mail them to their relatives, like, look how cool this was. The mob is looking for blood, though, and they hear a rumor that about 800 or so black laborers who work at the cotton pressing factory on the waterfront are planning to march into town to fight them. So they go down to try to get to them first, and they wheel out one of their machine guns to the factory. The white owner actually has to stand up on some cotton bales to try to defuse the situation, but it only stops because the white mob hears another rumor that another group of black men is now assembling a few blocks away. This group of black men had heard all the commotion from the printing press burning down and feared that their homes and families were next, so they leave their job on the wharf and are able to find a handful of old guns and are trying to make it back to their neighborhoods to defend their homes before the white mob gets there. There's a standoff for a bit, and then a shot is fired. Most eyewitnesses say it was one of the white men, and it was roughly 25 black men versus 500 white men. The black men quickly disperse, and the white men follow them and shoot any black man that they see, some of whom are just walking home from work or standing on the corner, not involved at all. Walker Taylor, one of the white supremacist leaders and leaders of the North Carolina militia, telegraphs Governor Russell saying that it's the black men who have started rioting, so Russell declares martial law and tells Taylor to go in with his troops. So then the militia are patrolling through the black neighborhoods to prevent retaliation. They believe the rumors that black people were stockpiling weapons in churches, so the militia then goes around to all the black churches and towns, shoots up the front doors with machine guns, and forces the pastors to let them in. They did not find a single weapon in any of the churches. The mob then turns their attention to Manhattan Park, which is the community center that I mentioned earlier, but white people thought of it as a place where black men went to get drunk and cause trouble, so when the mob gets there, they shoot it up from the outside. At the same time, black people start to gather their families together, grab what they can from their homes, and start fleeing town. It's estimated that around 2,000 black people flee during this chaos. They run into swamps, forests, and the black cemetery, all places that they think that the white mob wouldn't go into. One witness, who was a little girl at the time, says that her family hid in the riverbanks, and she remembers a family member covering her mouth to stop her from screaming every time a dead body would float by them down the river. The white mob continues to burn down black homes and businesses and kill any black people they see. Most of the shooting stops only when they realize that most of the black people had fled, so the white committee and Waddell pivot to now taking over the city government. They call in the sitting government, including Silas P. Wright, the white Republican mayor, and force him to resign at gunpoint. And then they do the same thing to the members of the city council and other officers, both black and white, which is a coup. The definition of a coup is a sudden, violent, and unlawful seizure of power from the government. Waddell takes office as mayor. The revolt had the support of many of the most powerful men in the city. For example, one of these men was George Roundtree, an attorney and advisor to the coup leaders, who later on in 1899 serves as the chairman of the state legislative committee of constitutional reform that drafted and sponsored the so-called grandfather clause, providing that male citizens could vote if they could read and write or if their grandfather voted, thereby denying most black men the right to vote. Then the new city government says that it's the black leadership who are the rabble rousers, and they tell them that they need to get out of town. Any black leaders who are left are literally taken to the train station by armed white men, and they also did this to any remaining fusionist white allies. All of the major newspapers, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, send reporters down there to cover the incident, and the white supremacists would actually meet the reporters and tell them that it was a race riot and that the black people started it, and the white people were just there defending the city from destruction. This also is a very similar rhetoric to the Tulsa massacre and other massacres of black towns that happen a little bit later, but we'll talk about those in future episodes. But the black newspapers actually go into town and they get a more accurate description of what occurred that day because they actually talked to black people and survivors. We still don't really know how many black people were killed. The estimates range anywhere from 40 to 60 all the way up to a few hundred, but the records we do have don't mention any white people being killed. The survivors had nowhere to go to try to find their deceased loved ones or anywhere to go to report someone missing, so that's why there's such a wide range of deaths. Before the coup, Wilmington, like I mentioned, was 56% black black, but after it became a white majority. And the latest census data has the white population at almost 70% and the black population at a little over 14%. So the coup had a lasting effect even 100 plus years later. And Alex Manly does survive. He escapes to Washington, D.C., where he marries his fiancée. They then relocate to Philadelphia, where Manly works as a painter for the rest of his life and never really talks about what happened in Wilmington. In 1900, Waddell moves to retract the 15th Amendment and lawfully disenfranchise black men, and in the meantime passes local laws to keep black men from voting, like I mentioned, the grandfather clause and poll taxes. And yes, that's right, Waddell continues to be the mayor. And to show how effective these laws were, in 1896, remember there's 126,000 black men registered to vote, and by 1902, only 6,100. And similar to what we talked about in the Robert Smalls episode with Louisiana voting restrictions, North Carolina would not have another black federal representative until 1992. This is due to the legislation that comes from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, like the Voting Rights Act, which, if you're paying attention to the news, has slowly been dismantled by Republicans and the Supreme Court, most recently being the Calise versus Louisiana. And if you're wondering what happened to Waddell and the other white men who led this coup, or the thousands of men that participated in the mob, killing black people, chasing them out of town, burning their homes and properties, well, nothing actually happens to them at all in terms of punishment or being held accountable. In fact, what does happen to them is that they become more powerful. Yeah. And ready to get more pissed? Charles A. Cox eventually becomes the governor of North Carolina. Good old Furnifold Simmons becomes a U.S. senator for the next 30 years. And one of his election pins says, quote, "For senator, the chieftain of white supremacy." And Josephus Daniels becomes a secretary of Navy and then the ambassador to Mexico. Their successful coup and any lack of consequences proved to themselves and the white supremacy movement that white government was the only legitimate and or good government. And the coup is basically the start of the Jim Crow era in the South. And here's a little crossover moment with next week's episode. In 1902, Waddell, still the mayor of Wilmington, met with the United Daughters of the Confederacy when they had their meeting there, and he applauded their work to restore the reputation of the Confederate men. Remember, he was also a vet. He said that the women had achieved enormous success in, quote, "vindicating before the world the causes in which their Southern countrymen engaged," end quote. The Wilmington coup is told very differently in local history books, like in the 1930s, 1940s, basically repeating that story that it was a race riot started by black people and the white people were simply there to defend themselves and the city and to restore peace and order. After the generation of men who participated in this coup died, people started to realize that this was not a good look for the city, so they basically buried the incident in the story. The local historians and even descendants who grew up in North Carolina, either of the white supremacist groups or the black survivors, had no idea about the Wilmington coup until much later in life, and they never learned about it in school. And then in 1998, for the centennial anniversary, it's the first time that white and black people come together to actually talk about it, but it seems to be kind of more of like, look, we're all cool now, from the older white descendants of the coup leaders. And you can see this in the PBS documentary called American Coup. That's actually where I got a lot of this information from. I highly recommend checking it out. It's very interesting because they talk to a lot of these descendants, both of the white coup leaders and the black survivors. So it's really interesting to get their perspective and to see how both the survivors are trying to kind of reclaim that history and to honor their loved ones, and how the white descendants are kind of grappling with their own family history and how do they reconcile it, and, you know, can they do anything to kind of bring justice or peace or, you know, anything, because at that time there was no consequences for their descendants. So it's a very interesting documentary to kind of just to get their descendants' perspectives. I think that's a really cool part of this history, is even though we can't speak to the firsthand accounts, we can get some oral histories from the descendants. What the historians and descendants of the Black leaders and citizens also talk about in the documentary is the loss of wealth that occurred for the entire Black population in Wilmington and other Black cities like it, like I mentioned, like in Tulsa, and how all of it was gone like overnight. With a self-proclaimed white supremacist group in charge of the government, like who would the Black people go to in order to get any sort of compensation for lost or damaged property or money that was in the previously Black-owned banks? You know what I mean? They literally had to start over with whatever they were able to carry out of Wilmington into whatever new city they went to. And if you compare that life to a life where they were able to continue on in Wilmington with their businesses and their property and homes, and were able to pass that on to their children like their white Wilmington counterparts did. And in the documentary, the descendants don't have many greats in front of granddaughter or grandson, you know what I mean? So it wasn't really that long ago, only a handful of generations removed. How different would these descendants' lives be if their ancestors hadn't been ran out of Wilmington or killed? The documentary ends with descendants of both the white leaders and the Black survivors talking about their family's legacies, and you can see the juxtaposition. For example, Daniel's descendants still owned the newspaper, and some were high up in other newspapers, and the documentary shows them sort of having to reckon with their ancestors' decisions. And again, I really recommend watching this documentary and hearing from the descendants. It puts a much more real spin on it, like it's not some abstract distant event from history. Interestingly, Manly's home and printing press lots are still empty, at least at the time of the documentary, and the descendants of the survivors of the Wilmington Coup gather there to reflect and celebrate their ancestors. Historian Laura Edwards writes about the coup, quote, "What happened in Wilmington became an affirmation of white supremacy, not just in one city, but in the South and in the nation as a whole," end quote, as it affirmed that invoking whiteness eclipsed the legal citizenship, individual rights, and equal protection under the law that Black Americans were guaranteed under the 14th Amendment. And it wasn't until the 1950s that it was even recognized as a massacre, and it would take 100 years after it happened for it to be recognized as an insurrection or a coup, with distorted media being one of the weapons used in its aftermath. And like I mentioned earlier, this coup had long-term effects because Wilmington's Black population is still around 14%. Remember, it was a Black majority town with 50% of the population being Black in the end of the 1800s. And I think the part that is most frustrating and angering to me was to see how much and how far Black people had gotten just a few decades after the end of slavery. You know, they were business owners, police and firefighters, bank owners, homeowners. They were representing their cities and states in local and federal positions, only to see how quickly it was all taken away from them and destroyed by white supremacy. And then with all the laws put into place during Jim Crow, this greatly suppressed Black people's ability to rebuild any of that success and wealth that they had started to get in the latter half of the 1800s. And I don't think I can say this enough, these Jim Crow laws weren't dismantled until the 1960s, and even then, that's just laws that were passed. Many southern states flat out refused to follow any of the civil rights legislation or found loopholes and workarounds so that they didn't have to. And legislation doesn't automatically erase the racism or hatred that people have within them. So it's not like the Civil Rights Act was passed and then, you know, it was all rainbows and sunshine and, you know, Black and white people were holding hands, you know, singing Kumbaya and everything was happily ever after. The 1960s are when a lot of us millennials' parents were born. They were the first generation born under the civil rights reform. So no, this wasn't that long ago. And the older Congress people that are still serving today would have probably gone to segregated schools if they went to public school. So I don't want to hear about it, that this was all so long ago and no one's racist anymore. Look at how fast these southern states moved to redraw their congressional districts to eliminate all Black representation after the latest SCOTUS ruling. I mean, I feel like it's pretty obvious. And speaking of, I really like this quote from PBS North Carolina executive producer Rachel Rainey. Quote, "The documentary American Coup, Wilmington 1898 is a cautionary tale for our country about a perilous breakdown of a cornerstone of our democracy, fair and free elections," end quote. To wrap things up, I'll go through some of the more recent developments that have happened in trying to raise awareness about the Wilmington Coup. In 2000, the North Carolina legislature set up a commission to look into the attacks, which lawmakers later acknowledged to have been obscure in state history before then. The committee released a damning report in 2006. The same year, the News and Observer, Daniel's newspaper, and the Charlotte Observer apologized for the roles their 19th century leaders had played in the violence. And the North Carolina Democratic Party also apologized in 2007. That same year, the General Assembly passed a resolution officially recognizing the coup. The resolution said that the legislature, quote, expresses profound regret that violence, intimidation, and force were used to replace a duly elected local government, that people lost their livelihoods and were forced to leave their homes, and that the government was unsuccessful in protecting its citizens during that time, end quote. And a historical marker was put up in 2018 that reads, quote, Wilmington Coup. Armed crowd met November 10th, 1898 at Armory here, March 6th block southeast, and burned office of Daily Record, black-owned newspaper edited by Alex Manley. Violence left up to 60 blacks dead, led to overthrow of city government and the installation of coup leader Alfred Moore Waddell as mayor. Race riot was part of a statewide political campaign based on calls for white supremacy and exploitation of racial tensions, end quote. And I mean, words are all well and good, and I do think it's important for those in charge to recognize and admit the wrongs that have occurred, but I also think that words and apologies alone fall short. The North Carolina Commission that I mentioned even recommended compensation for the descendants of the roughly 2,100 Black people who fled during the coup. The commission itself did not provide any cost estimates, but there was a compensation advocate, Larry Thomas of Chapel Hill, that was quoted in one of the articles that I read saying that the estimated economic losses calculated today are, quote, probably in the billions of dollars, end quote. The commission also recommended incentives for minority small businesses and help for minority home ownership. It also recommended that the history of the incident be taught in public schools. The legislation that came as the result of the commission's findings was called the 1898 Wilmington Riot Reconciliation Act of 2007. It included formal apologies and proposed allowing families to sue for inflation-adjusted, interest-bearing damages. However, the bill ultimately died in committee and no other legislation surrounding this has passed. The descendants and activists are still working to get legislation passed, though. One of the groups is called Coming to the Table, whose vision for the United States is, quote, of a just and truthful society that acknowledges and seeks to heal from the racial wounds of the past, from slavery and the many forms of racism it spawned, end quote. And their mission is to provide leadership, resources, and a supportive environment for all those who wish to acknowledge and heal wounds from racism that is rooted in the United States' history of slavery. And I'll link their website in the episode description if you want to learn more about what they're doing. You can also donate to them at their website, comingtothetable.org/support-us. Again, that'll be linked in the description. And that's all I have for you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I hope this episode is a reminder that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. Bye.